National Electrical Code Section 300.15L addresses manholes and handhole enclosures. This section explains specific requirements regarding the use of boxes or conduit bodies for conductors within these enclosures. Specifically, Section 300.15L states that where these enclosures are accessible only to qualified persons, a box or conduit body is generally not required for conductors within the manhole or handhole. However, there is a crucial exception to this rule. The exception states that a box or conduit body is required when conductors are connecting to electrical equipment within the manhole or handhole enclosure. The purpose of this exception is to provide an additional level of safety when electrical equipment is involved. This is because the risk of electrical shock or other hazards is higher when working with electrical equipment. Let's break down the key components. Firstly, accessibility is limited to qualified persons. This is a critical prerequisite for the exception to apply. Only individuals who have the necessary knowledge, training, and experience in electrical work are permitted to access these enclosures without additional protection for the conductors. Secondly, conductors do not need to be in a box or conduit body. This means that the conductors can be run freely within the enclosure, without being enclosed in a protective box or conduit body. This can save time and money on installation, as well as make it easier to work on the conductors. Thirdly, the exception, where connecting to electrical equipment, mandates the use of a box or conduit body. This is to protect the conductors from damage and to prevent accidental contact with the electrical equipment. If conductors are directly connected to equipment, they must be properly enclosed. The rationale behind this provision lies in the inherent safety considerations associated with manholes and handhole enclosures. These spaces often house complex electrical systems and are typically located underground or in other areas where access is restricted. Because only qualified personnel are permitted to enter these enclosures, the risk of accidental contact with energized conductors is significantly reduced. Qualified persons are trained to recognize and avoid electrical hazards, and they are equipped with the necessary personal protective equipment to work safely around electricity. This allowance recognizes the expertise and training of these individuals and reduces the need for additional protective measures that would otherwise be required in areas accessible to the general public. It's important to understand the definition of qualified person as it applies to electrical work. A qualified person is someone who has the skills and knowledge related to the construction and operation of electrical equipment and installations and has received safety training to recognize and avoid the hazards involved. This training may include, but is not limited to, lockout/tagout procedures, arc flash awareness, and the proper use of personal protective equipment. Therefore, only individuals meeting this definition can access the manholes and handhole enclosures where the exception to the box or conduit body requirement is applied. Now let's talk about the practical applications of this rule. Imagine a scenario where a utility company needs to install new cables in existing manhole to connect to underground substations. If the manhole is only accessible to qualified personnel, the utility company can run the cables directly through the manhole without having to install boxes or conduit bodies. However, if the cables need to be connected to electrical equipment within the manhole, such as a transformer or switchgear, then boxes or conduit bodies would be required for those connections. This could involve using conduit to protect the conductors as they transition from the open run to the equipment terminals. This can provide a physical barrier to prevent accidental contact and protect the conductors from damage. It is very important to note that even when boxes or conduit bodies are not required, the conductors must still be properly supported and secured within the manhole or handhole enclosure. This is to prevent them from sagging, chafing, or otherwise being damaged. The National Electrical Code provides specific requirements for supporting and securing conductors, which must be followed. The support structure must be adequate to handle the weight of the conductors and any potential stress from environmental factors. The conductors should be arranged in a neat and workmanlike manner to facilitate future maintenance and troubleshooting. Furthermore, all electrical work must comply with all other applicable requirements of the National Electrical Code and any other applicable local codes or regulations. This includes, but is not limited to, proper grounding, overcurrent protection, and wiring methods. It's also crucial to consider the specific environmental conditions within the manhole or handhole enclosure. These enclosures can be subject to moisture, temperature extremes, and exposure to corrosive substances. Therefore, conductors and any associated hardware must be suitable for the environment in which they are installed. The choice of conductor insulation, for example, should be based on the operating temperature and the potential for exposure to moisture or chemicals. Any metal component should be corrosion resistant or properly protected to prevent deterioration. Let's discuss some potential scenarios where confusion might arise regarding the application of this rule. One common question is whether the exception applies if the manhole or handhole is occasionally accessed by unqualified persons. The answer is no. The exception only applies if the enclosure is consistently and exclusively accessible to qualified persons. If there is any possibility that unqualified persons could enter the enclosure, then the general rule requiring boxes or conduit bodies would apply. Another area of confusion is the definition of electrical equipment. The National Electrical Code defines electrical equipment as a general term including material, fittings, devices, appliances, fixtures, apparatus, and the like used as a part of or in connection with an electrical installation. This is a broad definition that encompasses a wide range of components, so it's important to carefully consider whether any item within the enclosure meets this definition. Remember that the purpose of this rule is to provide a balance between safety and practicality. By allowing qualified persons to work with conductors that are not enclosed in boxes or conduit bodies, the National Electrical Code recognizes their expertise and reduces the burden of unnecessary protective measures. However, it also ensures that the safety of unqualified persons is not compromised by requiring additional protection when they may be present. In summary, National Electrical Code Section 300.15L provides an exception to the general rule requiring boxes or conduit bodies for conductors in manholes and handhole enclosures. This exception applies only when the enclosures are accessible exclusively to qualified persons, and it does not apply when conductors are connecting to electrical equipment. When working in these environments, always prioritize safety and follow all applicable electrical codes and regulations. Always use the proper personal protective equipment. It is also good practice to conduct a thorough risk assessment before commencing any electrical work to identify and mitigate potential hazards. Consider specific examples of when the exception would and would not apply. For instance, if you are installing a new fiber optic cable that runs through a manhole that also contains electrical conductors, the fiber optic cable itself would not need to be in conduit provided it is not connecting to any electrical equipment, and the manhole is only accessible to qualified personnel. However, if you were then installing a power supply within the manhole to power a repeater for the fiber optic cable, the wiring to that power supply would need to be in conduit. Another example would be if you are running new control wires within a handhole to a traffic signal controller. If the handhole is only accessible to qualified technicians, the control wires do not necessarily need to be run in conduit unless they are connecting directly to the controller itself. In this case, conduit would be required for the final connection. Consider a situation where splices are being made to existing cables within the manhole or handhole. The exception would apply as long as the splices are not directly connected to any electrical equipment. The splices themselves, however, would need to be properly insulated and protected using approved methods. For example, using heat shrink tubing or other approved splicing kits to ensure that the connections are safe and reliable. Think about the implications of this code section for specific industries. For example, utility companies often have many manholes and handholes as part of their underground infrastructure. This exception can save them a significant amount of time and money on installation and maintenance. Telecommunications companies also utilize handholes and manholes for their cabling infrastructure and can also benefit from this exception. However, it is important for these companies to ensure that their employees are properly trained and qualified to work in these environments. Consider the impact of this code section on the design and construction of electrical systems. When designing a new electrical system that includes manholes or handholes, the designer should carefully consider who will have access to these enclosures. If it is possible to restrict access to qualified personnel only, then the designer can take advantage of the exception and reduce the amount of conduit and boxes required. This can result in a more cost-effective and efficient design. This also requires coordination with the facility owner or operator to ensure that they have procedures in place to control access to the enclosures. The designer also needs to take into account any future modifications or expansions that may be planned for the system. If there is a possibility that unqualified personnel may need to access the enclosures in the future, then it may be necessary to install conduit and boxes from the outset. Look at some of the potential safety hazards associated with working in manholes and handholes. These enclosures can be confined spaces, which means that they may have limited ventilation and may contain hazardous gases or fumes. It is important to test the atmosphere within the enclosure before entering and to provide adequate ventilation. Manholes and handholes can also be wet or damp, which can increase the risk of electric shock. It is important to use ground fault circuit interrupters or GFCIs when working with electrical equipment in these environments. Furthermore, manholes and handholes can be located in areas with heavy traffic or other hazards. It is important to take precautions to protect workers from these hazards, such as using traffic cones or barricades. Consider the role of personal protective equipment, also known as PPE, when working in manholes and handholes. Qualified personnel should always wear appropriate PPE, such as safety glasses, gloves, and operated clothing when working with electrical equipment. The type of PPE required will depend on the specific hazards present in the environment. For example, if there is a risk of arc flash, then arc-rated clothing is essential. If there is a risk of electric shock, then insulated gloves should be worn. It is important to inspect PPE before each use to ensure that it is in good condition and that it provides adequate protection. The employer is responsible for providing employees with the necessary PPE and for ensuring that they are properly trained on how to use it. Talk about the importance of training and certification for qualified personnel. To be considered a qualified person, individuals must have the necessary skills and knowledge to perform electrical work safely. This typically requires formal training, such as an apprenticeship or vocational program. It may also require certification from a recognized organization, such as the National Institute for Certification in Engineering Technologies or NEC. Training should cover topics such as electrical theory, wiring methods, safety procedures, and the use of PPE. Certification demonstrates that the individual has met a certain standard of knowledge and skill. Ongoing training is also important to keep qualified personnel up to date on the latest codes, standards, and technologies. This ensures that they are able to perform their work safely and effectively. Review the importance of proper documentation and record keeping. It is important to maintain accurate records of all electrical work performed in manholes and handholes. This documentation should include information such as the date of the work, the names of the qualified personnel who performed the work, a description of the work performed, and any materials used. It should also include any test results or inspections that were performed. Proper documentation can help to ensure that the electrical system is properly maintained and that any problems are identified and corrected promptly. It can also be helpful in the event of an accident or incident. In some cases, documentation may be required by law or regulation. Look at some of the potential legal and regulatory implications of this code section. Failure to comply with the National Electrical Code can result in fines, penalties, and even criminal charges. It is important for electrical contractors and installers to be familiar with all applicable codes and regulations and to ensure that their work is in compliance. It is also important to obtain the necessary permits and inspections before commencing any electrical work. In the event of an accident or incident, failure to comply with the National Electrical Code can increase the liability of the responsible parties. This is because it can be seen as evidence of negligence or recklessness. Consider the long-term implications of this code section for the reliability and safety of electrical systems. By allowing qualified personnel to work with conductors that are not enclosed in boxes or conduit bodies, the National Electrical Code recognizes their expertise and reduces the burden of unnecessary protective measures. However, It is important to ensure that these individuals are properly trained and equipped to perform their work safely. It is also important to maintain accurate records of all electrical work performed and to conduct regular inspections to identify and correct any problems. By following these practices, it is possible to maintain the reliability and safety of electrical systems while also taking advantage of the flexibility provided by this code section. Imagine how technology will shape the future of manhole and handhole safety. As technology advances, there may be new and innovative ways to improve the safety of working in manholes and handholes. For example, robots or drones could be used to inspect and perform maintenance on electrical equipment in these enclosures. This would reduce the need for humans to enter these potentially hazardous environments. Sensors and monitoring systems could be used to detect hazardous gases, temperature extremes, or other dangerous conditions. This would allow workers to take precautions before entering the enclosure. Virtual reality or augmented reality technology could be used to train qualified personnel on how to work safely in manholes and handholes. This would allow them to practice their skills in a safe and controlled environment. By embracing these new technologies, it is possible to create a safer and more efficient working environment for those who maintain and operate our electrical infrastructure. Consider this rule in the context of other related sections of the National Electrical Code. National Electrical Code Section 300.15L is just one small part of a much larger and more complex document. It is important to understand how this section relates to other sections of the National Electrical Code to ensure that all applicable requirements are met. For example, National Electrical Code Section 314 covers the requirements for outlet, device, pull, and junction boxes, conduit bodies, fittings, and handhole enclosures. National Electrical Code Section 310 covers the requirements for conductors for general wiring. National Electrical Code Section 250 covers the requirements for grounding and bonding. By understanding how these different sections of the National Electrical Code interact, it is possible to design and install electrical systems that are safe, reliable, and compliant.